Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. God bless you all.
Good morning, Senators. Adoption of minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. I beg leave.
Are we organized and ready to go, Senators? To get started.
Madam President, I beg leave. First of all, let me formally welcome members opposite back. I wasn't here during their first appearance, but we're happy to have them back, indeed. And on that note, let me beg leave to move for the adoption of the minutes of the last meeting of the Senate of the 6th of March 2019, if I may obtain a second.
It has been moved and seconded that the minutes be adopted as presented. As many as are in favor would say aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The minutes are accepted as presented. Adopted, rather, as presented. Motions for leave of absence. Swearing in of new senators. Communications by the President. I just briefly would like to join all the voices of women around the Bahamas and globally as well, as we recognize and celebrate the social, economics, cultural, and political achievements of women, and a call to action for accelerating equality and empowerment for all in our society. I trust in the not-too-distant future, the Bahamas will remove all forms of discrimination from our Constitution, especially as it relates to women. We will continue the celebrations today during a panel discussion and a luncheon on Friday as well, as various organizations continue the conversation, think equal, build smart, innovate for change, and balance for better. So again, I congratulate all those women in the Bahamas and globally who are doing things today to celebrate International Women's Day. Messages from the Governor General.
None.
Messages from the House of Assembly.
Bahamas number 27. Message to the Honorable the President and Honorable members of the Senate from the Speaker and representatives of the Honorable House of Assembly. The House of Assembly acquaints the Honorable the Senate that they have passed the following bill and desire the consent of that Honorable Chamber, namely, a bill for an act to update the law relating to the regulation of investment funds business, to bring the law into harmony with international standards and best practices, to expand the scope of the powers of the Securities Commission of the Bahamas in relation to regulated persons and parties related
I
to
need a copy of the
investment
resolution
funds, to protect investors, the public, and the reputation of the Bahamas,
It's on the
to
agenda.
repeal and replace the Investment Funds Act, Chapter 369A, and for connected matters. House of Assembly, Nassau, 6th March 2019, House in Mutri, Speaker.
Laying of documents by ministers.
None.
Communications by ministers.
None.
Communications by senators. Questions. Answers to questions.
None.
Presentations of petitions.
None.
Appointment of select committees.
None.
Reports of committees.
None.
First reading of bills.
May it please you, Madam President, I beg leave to move for the first reading of following bill just received from the House of Assembly, a bill for an act to update the law relating to the regulation of investment fund business, to bring the law into harmony with international standards and best practices, to expand the scope of the powers of the Security Commission of the Bahamas in relation to regulated persons and parties related to investment funds, to protect investors, the public, and the reputation of the Bahamas, to repeal and replace the Investment Funds Act, Chapter 369A, and for connected matters. If I may obtain a seconder.
It has been moved and seconded that the Investment Funds Bill 2019 be read a first time. As many as are in favor would say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Order that the bill be read a first time.
A bill for an act to update the law relating to the regulation of investment funds to bring the law into harmony with international standards and best practices, to expand the scope of the powers of the Securities Commission of the Bahamas in relation to regulated persons and parties related to investment funds, to protect investors, the public, and the reputation of the Bahamas, to repeal and replace the Investment Funds Act, Chapter 369A, and for connected matters.
Further first reading of bills?
No further.
Second reading and committal of bills?
None.
Committee of the whole Senate?
None.
Third reading and passing of bills?
None.
Consideration of House amendments? Resolutions?
None. Yes, there is. Sorry. Mea culpa.
The chair will now recognize Senator the Honorable Carl Bethel.
Indeed. Very short meeting. Madam President, I beg leave to move the following resolution. Whereas subsection 1 of section 77 of the Anti-Terrorism Act 2018, number 27 of 2018, otherwise called the Act, provides that the Attorney General may, subject to the affirmative resolution, make regulations to give effect to the Act, and whereas the Attorney General has made the Anti-Terrorism Regulations 2019 to provide for the implementation of United Nations Security Council resolutions 1267, made in 1999, 1373, made in 2001, 1718, made in 2006, and their successor resolutions, and any future United Nations Security Council resolutions which impose targeted financial sanctions in the context of the financing or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction related to measures to be taken with regard to the designated and listed terrorist entities or individuals. And whereas the Attorney General has made the anti-terrorism regulations in the form attached, now therefore be it resolved that this House approves the anti-terrorism regulations 2019. Madam President, the members of this House, having been an integral part of our efforts over the past year and a half, are well aware of the fundamental ground-shifting tectonic changes that have been made in the financial services sector as a result of a slew of new legislation that have been passed of late. Foremost among them is the new Anti-Terrorism Act. This act criminalizes and provides for the freezing and the forfeiture of funds alleged or found to be used in the financing of terrorist acts, terrorist training, proliferation offenses, and the financing of the trade in fissile and nuclear materials, as well inclusive of biological and chemical weaponry. This is a cutting-edge legislation, and it also sets up a framework wherein the Bahamas is able to be and remain fully compliant with all United Nations Security Council resolutions passed to combat terrorism, terrorism financing, nuclear proliferation, and the financing of the illicit arms trade in nuclear regulations that have been promulgated and have been approved in the other place need to be approved in this place in order to fully come into force. The coming into force of these regulations will make the Bahamas fully compliant, not only in its anti-terrorism regime, but will close the circle of full compliance with all of the anti-money laundering, counter-financing of terrorism initiatives of the international community, which initiatives are spearheaded by the Financial Action Task Force. It is therefore a critical step, a critical closing step in our full compliance and technical compliance with the FATF 40 recommendations. With the coming into force of these regulations, if we were to be reevaluated now as we were reevaluated in December of last year, we would probably go up by another 3 FATF recommendations to being fully compliant, not just with 30, but with 33 of the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force, which would truly place the Bahamas in the very front row of compliant countries. We recently attended a plenary meeting of the Financial Action Task Force, a delegation from the Bahamas, and I can assure you that, and every Bahamian, that the notable and substantial progress that the Bahamas has made has been duly noted by the assessors. It is acknowledged to us, and was acknowledged to our teams, that the Bahamas in record time has thoroughly repositioned itself in the minds of the global community as now being a country that is on the verge of full compliance, and that full compliance is on the verge of being recognized. There are still more things we need to do, but they are now in the realm of technical implementation. There is still some work to be done in showing the effectiveness of our implementation of all of the new laws in the new financial regime. We understand that there was a comment by a member of the European Parliament. No. He is a member of the European Parliament and therefore would reflect a more political and less well-informed point of view. It is clear that the commentator was utterly ignorant of not only the changes that we have made, but also of the fact that there have been money laundering convictions ever since the first Proceeds of Crime Act was passed in 1996 in the Bahamas. And for someone to state that the Bahamas does not prosecute money laundering is the height of ignorance. Height of ignorance. More so, since the passage of our laws in 2018, the Bahamas has increased the levels of money laundering charges and has increased the rate of conviction of money laundering offenses. So of 40 offenses charged last year, 19 have resulted in conviction and forfeiture of millions of dollars that sit in the confiscated asset fund today as I speak. There are 40 offenses were charged over the last year and a half. Yes, and 19 have resulted in convictions. netting roughly $2.7 million that has gone into the confiscated asset fund. Let me say that I'm in the process of drafting a response that will be sent to this member of the European Parliament. I won't sign the letter. The permanent secretary will sign that letter to him. But he will be thoroughly disabused of his ignorance. Okay? This is the Bahamas. We don't play fool. When we set our minds to perform a task, we do it. We are Bahamians. You know, slackers, we don't play fool. When we set our minds to a job, let me say it again, we perform and we do what we have to do. So this bill it sets up a framework, in short, these regulations, wherein once the United Nations Security Council designates or lists a person or an entity as being a terrorist or a nuclear proliferator or an arms trafficker, etc., and they promulgate a resolution to that effect, it is able to be communicated to me or the person in this office, the Attorney General, as the competent authority, who will then have it distributed through the different contact points to financial institutions, etc. Due notice will be given to any entity that is designated or listed found to be in the Bahamas or found to have funds in the Bahamas, and they will be given all rights in terms of access to legal process to challenge that in courts of law. Failing which, or failing any successful challenge, the process of forfeiture will begin. Of course, once an entity is listed or designated, any funds found are immediately frozen, and are immediately subject to being forfeited. There are two aspects of it, and these regulations reflect the new constitutional dichotomy between the Attorney General as the chief and principal law enforcer under the Constitution and the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. So to the extent that information comes in that is international in nature and requires international responses and interaction, those matters would be dealt with by the Attorney General as the competent authority. However, if there are domestic matters that fall within that purview, and domestic activity exclusively is required through Bahamian law enforcement agencies in terms of investigation and ultimately process in our domestic courts for criminal matters, those matters will be referred directly to the Director of Public Prosecutions, who, of course, is the contact person and, in fact, in whose name all prosecutions in the Bahamas must now take place, including those that will be initiated by the police based on FIU information. And so these regulations really set out the practical working framework which will guide every single financial institution in their adherence to United Nations Security Council listings and designations of terrorist entities. Let me say that the issue at hand, and it's a really small one, is the frequency with which we will expect that they will scrub their files, meaning that they will scrutinize their files. We observed at recent Caribbean Financial Action Task Force plenaries where that was a very pressing point that was pressed on a jurisdiction that was under mutual evaluation, and they were unable to really show a consistent pattern of requiring their financial institutions to scrutinize, or as the common word is, scrub their files for terrorist entities. So we are in close consultation with the financial sector. We will be requiring very frequent and documented scrubbing of their files as and when these listings are put in, publicized and placed in their possession. We will be requiring the utmost scrutiny to ensure not just that on Monday a listed entity doesn't have the money, but to make sure that next week Monday it doesn't appear and you don't do anything. It appears and nothing is done about it. So the intent will be to have a vigorous screening regime to ensure that at no point can terrorist funds of listed or designated terrorist entities enter or remain untouched in the Bahamian financial services sector, whether on the domestic or what would formerly have been the offshore side. Now, let me just make this point, that as a result of the removal of the preferential exemptions act that was passed, all banks are now Bahamian banks. All the offshore banks are now fully Bahamian banks. There's no such thing as offshore anymore. So all will be subjected, whether it's the Royal Bank or any of the formerly offshore banks, to the same regime of scrutiny and oversight, and the same levels of internal controls will be demanded and expected of every single participant in now the Bahamian banking system. And so with those few remarks, I commend these regulations to this House for its approval, and I am very confident that we are truly, truly making stellar progress. There's only one last area where we need to focus, and this is at an administrative level. It is to improve the technological capacity of the Financial Intelligence Unit through the acquisition of appropriate, bespoke, meaning carefully, specially written software that will allow the Financial Intelligence Unit to communicate directly with financial services, financial institutions, which financial institutions will also include not simply banks and trust companies, but will include all designated non-financial institutions. And that would be law firms, accountants, pawnbrokers, anybody dealing in cash or cash or similar instruments. And so we intend to have, at the end of the day, and within a matter of weeks, and certainly before June, a very robust, interconnected financial intelligence unit that is able, at a moment's notice, to communicate with financial institutions as defined and expansively defined, and to obtain necessary information necessary to fully comply with these anti-terrorism regulations, as well as other anti-money laundering issues. And finally, just to take it one step further, and to inform the Bahamian people, the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act, which was passed in 2019, is now in the process of being operationalized, brought into effect. We have accessed software and the software suppliers who are active in the region in at least 2 other countries, one other jurisdiction, not a country, where they have an operational and effective system of competent authority access to beneficial ownership information We have an agreement in principle. They're coming down again this week we're going to finalize all of the relationships, and within a month they will begin the process of installing the software and onboarding financial institutions, meaning bringing them on board with the system. It is a tried and true system that has been found to work in one of our competitive jurisdictions. It is a tried and true system that has been embraced by the industry in that jurisdiction, and we are calling on all of our financial institutions to embrace this initiative so that we are able over the next several months, and it will take approximately 8 months, to fully onboard all of the operators, if you will, in the sector, and we will have a robust but non-intrusive system of storing beneficial ownership information that is accessible. Each institution will be responsible for their own firewalls and their own information and the preservation thereof. But it will be accessible to the competent authority should a lawful reason arise, namely a documented, proven, or provable breach of anti-money laundering regulations or laws, breach of some other laws such as anti-terrorism law, etc. That beneficial ownership information will be available for lawful inquiry. The Bahamas has not bowed to pressure to have a central, publicly accessible beneficial ownership register. That is not happening in the Bahamas. What we are creating is a usable, efficient method by which law enforcement authorities, for justifiable and defensible law enforcement purposes, will have access to the beneficial ownership information in a non-intrusive manner, in a manner that does not permit of fishing expeditions, trawling for names, trawling for company names or individual names to collect any database of beneficial owners. And the competent authority will not be keeping any records or compiling its own database using the system. All proprietary information of financial institutions remains proprietary information. It is only on the basis of a lawful inquiry to protect against any breaches of the law, either domestic law or international law, that any information will be accessed through the system. On those notes, I commend. No, they couldn't. I commend, just on that point, the British government has mandated its overseas territories, which are its colonies, to, by I think 2022, I think they may take it to 2025, have an open registry. But they were not able to persuade themselves to impose the same discipline on their little islands called Crown dependencies in the Channel Islands. So right now, Great Britain is embarked on, it would appear to be, an inherently discriminatory cause of action, that one half of its possessions, being the overseas territories, will be subjected to a higher standard of disclosure than their competitors, being the other dependencies, not territories now, dependencies in the same business. And so how the British would reconcile that inherent discriminatory posture is a matter for their domestic politics. I merely observe that that is where they are, and we feel concerned for our neighbors who are our competitors, but they are our neighbors. The same limitations of geography, the same limitations of population size, the same limitations of limited natural resources afflict those overseas territories, our neighbors. And so we would hope that at the end of the day, whatever is good for the goose would be good for the gander, but that is a matter for British domestic politics, not Bahamian politics. Just on that observation to answer that. On these notes, Madam President, I commend these regulations to the approval of the House, and I thank you for your time.
Is there a second? The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Renard Henfield.
Good morning, Madam President, Senators, fellow Bahamians. I would like to associate myself first, Madam President, with your remarks ahead of International Women's Day tomorrow. And I will add, feminism isn't about making women strong. Women are already strong. It's about changing the way the world perceives strength. A quote from G.D. Anderson. And in the Senate today are amazing, talented, and strong young female journalists, Madam President. And for the life of me, I've never understood why persons in public life would attack female journalists for their investigative reporting in a different manner in which they would respond to male journalists or male talk show hosts. And I believe it must come to an end because, again, as the quote reminds us, women are already strong, and feminism isn't about making women strong. It is about changing the way the world perceives the strength of women. I renew my call today, Madam President, as I've said in this place and outside this place on numerous occasions, for our Bahamian women to have the right to pass on their citizenship automatically to their children, whether they're married or unmarried, whether the children are born in the Bahamas or born outside of the Bahamas. I renew that call today ahead of International Women's Day. I raised the issue a year ago, and I'm still here today raising the issue again. I also would ask that we as a country lead the way in this region when it comes to women in leadership and women in politics. There are countries around the world who have mandated that political parties offer at least 1/3 of their candidates as women. And I think it's time that we as a people, as a country, push that agenda, and not only push it, but lead the way. Because Bahamian women have done so much for men in politics in this country and for our country. And I think it's time we as men just not have them help us open the door and walk in, but that we reach back and bring our women forward. Minimum of 1/3 from every political party ahead of an election. With respect to the regulations, Madam President, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2018 modernized our laws in response to an ever-changing global community that is devastated every year by unfortunate instances of terrorism and extremism. And I intend to be very brief, and I know the leader of government business already spoke to the regulations and the resolution. But today as a parliament, with both the government side and the opposition side present, we demonstrate to our people, to the country, and to the world that the Bahamas is committed to taking all necessary steps to fighting terrorism, to keeping the Bahamian people and our visitors to this country safe. There are some that wish to criticize the government's agenda and its resolve to safeguarding our country and our people. And in my opinion, those with that stance are clearly misguided. We live in ever-changing times, Madam President. Terrorists don't discriminate when they set out to launch their cowardly attacks. They don't care for the political leanings of the families that are killed. They don't care for the economies of the countries that are destroyed. They don't care about race, and they don't care about skin color. They surely don't care about the effects on the psyche of the people. Now, we must remain vigilant as a government, and we must legislate and regulate so that terrorists know that the Bahamas offers no refuge. We must legislate and regulate so that terrorists know that we will find them before they launch an attack. And we must legislate and regulate so that our people know we will not be the site of a September 11th an embassy attack or an attack on our ports. Burying our heads in the sand, Madam President, won't change anything, and it won't shield us from terrorism or extremism. So we must legislate and regulate. If we do nothing, we make our beautiful country a target for extremists and terrorists to launch their attacks on our neighbors to the north. We're an island nation, and we rely heavily on tourism, and more so American tourists that visit our islands in the millions each year. We are committed to remaining an ally of the United States and protecting their citizens as well as any citizen that visits our country. I say today, Madam President, that we cannot be reactive in this fight against terrorism or extremism. We must be proactive. And I believe we ought to have a formal strategy to protect the people visiting, working, and or socializing in crowded areas in the Bahamas. You see, terrorists don't just rely on airplanes and bombs anymore. And we find that terrorists are now attacking crowded spaces, which are venues, events, concerts, festivals. And I don't see where we as a country have a strategy to protect people in crowded spaces or crowded places. And I believe we need to be proactive in that regard, especially in the Bay Street area, where there's so much pedestrian traffic and vehicles passing up and down every day. We live in a country with porous borders, where persons are sailing in and out any given day. And I believe we must have a strategy. Now, I have read the regulations and reread the regulations, Madam President, and I'm comforted in seeing the level of coordination by the National Identified Risk Framework Coordinator, which is nominated under Section 5 of the Proceeds of Crime Act, and the appointment of focal points, which includes persons from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, National Security, the Ministry of Tourism and Civil Aviation, the Ministry of Transport, Immigration, the Financial Intelligence Unit, and Legal Affairs. Additionally, the appointment of primary contacts, which includes persons from Civil Aviation, Bahamas Customs, the Port Authority, the Bahamas Maritime Authority, the Defense Force, and the Police Force. And it's obvious that the administration or the Attorney General's office and their team have thought out carefully the regulations, ensuring that all hands are on deck, all ministries and all relevant departments. Finally, the prevention of travel, Madam President. The Department of Immigration and Customs Department and any other appropriate law enforcement shall take measures to prevent the entry into or transit throughout the Bahamas of a designated entity. And the regulations call for strict compliance. Additionally, the Civil Aviation Authority shall take measures to prevent the landing, takeoff, or traveling through Bahamian airspace of aircraft suspected of being owned, leased, operated by, or on behalf of a designated entity. In conclusion, Madam President, the administration has passed a compendium of legislation in the last 2 years directed at keeping our people safe. And this regulation today demonstrates our commitment as a country to detect, prevent, and deter terrorists. While every ministry plays a strategic role, I must commend the AG's office for all their hard work over the last 21 months. I support the resolution, I support the Prime Minister, and I support this administration. May God continue to bless the country, our people, and our leaders. Thank you.
It has been moved and seconded that whereas subsection 1 of Section 77 of the Anti-Terrorism Act 2018, number 27 of 2018, the Act provides that the Attorney General may, subject to the affirmative resolution, make regulations to give effect to the Act. Now, therefore, be it resolved that this House approves the Anti-Terrorism Regulations 2019 as many. The Chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Mike Darville.
Thank you so much, Madam President. I would like to join the Attorney General and say it's good to be back. We have our reasons. We were always at work. There's no question that we were not working. The opposition stays committed to doing an excellent job to represent those who has allowed us to be where we are today. Madam President, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Madam President, today I rise to make a brief contribution in support of the Anti-Terrorism Regulation 2019, which allows the Attorney General to exercise his powers under Section 77(1) of the Anti-Terrorism Act 2018. We all can recall in 2018 the anti-terrorism bill criminalized terrorism, the financing of terrorism, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to provide for the detection, prevention, and prosecution and conviction and the confiscation and seizure of assets of those involved in such activities and related matters. We on this side understand very well the time-sensitive nature of these regulations, the critical need for the government to move swiftly to address many of the key requirements listed by the EU. The regulations before us today is connected in part to a compendium of bills recently passed in both houses to meet our international obligations in the financial services sector. And despite the many challenges in the industry, the financial service sector remains a second pillar of our local economy, and we, on both sides of the political divide, must do what is necessary to ensure that the environment is conducive for growth and development, and we meet our international requirements, and to ensure that as the goalposts move, the technical as well as the political factors associated with ensuring that our financial services sector remain robust move with the goalposts. That is the environment that we're in. And for us on this side, we remain committed to this industry and will do all in our power to ensure that those who are employed in the industry are able to have their jobs and to be able to make a positive contribution to its growth and development. But for me, what is really still the bad taste in our mouth on this side is the fact that there are some members of the Free National Movement who continue to blame the Progressive Liberal Party for what is happening in the financial services sector. This is a myth, and it's something that we are concerned about, and we will do all in our power to push back on this issue, because the record is yet to reflect that the Progressive Liberal Party is committed to the financial services sector, remain committed to the financial services sector, and will work hand in hand with the government to ensure that this sector remain robust. Madam President, I must remind members in this honorable chamber that it was during the Christie-led administration in 2003 when the first anti-terrorism bill was tabled in Parliament by the then Attorney General Alfred Sayers. At that time, the anti-terrorism legislation set out to criminalize a number of offenses and allow the freezing of funds of persons charged with terrorism offenses. The complexity of the 2018 bill and the regulations before us today is reflective of what is happening worldwide with terrorist organizations and their ability to infiltrate financial institutions around the world, including our offshore financial centers here in the Bahamas. Madam President, I would like to say from the onset that I support the regulations. I had an opportunity to read them, and it is obvious that things are changing, and whatever government that is in place, we must change with the time in order to meet our international obligations. Madam President, the United Nations Resolution 1373, adopted in September 2001, post 9/11, reaffirmed the condemnation of terrorism acts or the threat of international peace around the world, including our country. And the senator who spoke before me made it very clear that we have some vulnerable sites throughout the Bahamas, and particularly in our cruise ship industry, that is questionable, and I'm sure the authorities is working with the international community to ensure that we adopt policies that we can be more mindful and protective in the event that an unfortunate event happened in our country. The 1373 United Nations resolution also established the Counterterrorism Committee, who continue to work closely with all UN member states, including the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and organize a plan to suppress terrorism financing and the possibility of terrorism activity in our country. Madam President, we must also be mindful of the fact that the Bahamas is part of a global community with a strong financial services sector, and even after the recent talks about the possibility of blacklisting, it is important that we line up all of our laws in the country to be competitive in the region and meet the obligations that is essential to prevent the possibility of blacklisting. But it's important to point out that governance is continuous. And a few months ago, the leader on the side opposite foreshadowed the urgency and the importance of these regulations. I commend him for bringing them in here on a timely fashion so that we can put this behind us and move swiftly to catch up and to make sure that we stay ahead of the possibility of the shifting of the goalposts and put us in the limelight again of the possibility of blacklisting. We on this side, again, support the regulations, and we have said it in the public domain that we are prepared to work with the government as long as there's a transparent mechanism in place that we know what the government is doing in order to support the industry. Madam President, with the passing of these regulations, the Bahamas, despite the challenges we face, we are showing the world that we are committed we are committed to fight against terrorism and the possibility of terrorists using our jurisdiction for terrorism financing. Madam President, financial crimes have no boundaries. And the given realities that we face in this current environment, this administration must continue to ensure that every effort is made to show the world that we are committed to meet and comply with global standards. In addition to properly identifying and assessing the risks involved with money laundering and terrorism financing, to establish and maintain the strong regulatory regime that the Bahamas financial services sector is known to have. I believe that these regulations will help the government to accomplish this important mandate and plot the way forward to ensure that we stay ahead of the game rather than fighting against the tide. Madam President, it is indeed important to note that our financial services center is open for business, but we want to ensure that as a responsible member of the international community, we fulfill our commitment in protecting our country's reputation as a well-regulated international financial center, preventing the use of the banking system for criminal purposes, and the destabilization of our local economy. Furthermore, we must continue to anticipate and implement effective countermeasures to ensure that those who want to try to use our jurisdiction for money laundering and terrorism financing are stopped immediately in their tracks. There's no question that our financial services sector play a vital role in the support of the growth and development of our country, and also employ a large cross-section of professional Bahamians in the industry. Reputation for us is everything, and it's important that we fight hard to maintain our reputation and fight against those individuals who try to smear us or to make us look like a jurisdiction where things are not what they appear to be. The Bahamas is well regulated, and these regulations will give the Attorney General Office, our legal fraternity, as well as institution, the power and the teeth necessary to go after those individuals who try to come to our jurisdiction to provide funding for terrorist activities. Attracting new businesses to our shore in the current economic environment is competitive and very challenging. And so it's important for us to show the world that we are compliant, we have the regulatory regime in place to fight against these negativities and events that can smear our reputation. And I believe once again that these regulations would facilitate the industry because the regulatory agencies and investors would like to know that their money or activity is taking place in an environment that is safe and prevent even them from being smeared to be affiliated with a jurisdiction like the Bahamas. Furthermore, we must continue to manage the perception of our country and be cognizant of the fact that the views of organizations and businesses in our country who conduct businesses in the financial services sector play an important role in shaping our reputation and ensuring that our reputation is maintained as a tool to attract more business in our jurisdiction. Madam President, protecting financial services sector has long been a difficult task because of the regulatory bodies continuously changing the rules and regulations. These regulations today is clearly a move by the AG's office to ensure that we show those around the world that we not only have the laws, but we have the teeth necessary to ensure to go after those individuals who try to break the law in our jurisdiction. The AG has demonstrated in his contribution that our fight must be bipartisan, and if we're going to take that road and to be able to take on the bigger countries to fight the possible challenges and win, we must definitely be able to come to some common ground and to be able to work together to ensure that we have the financial services sector protected and that politics will not play a role in the way we move forward. Madam President, with those few words, I support the regulations, and we look forward to working closely with the government as it relates to a transparency. It's very important that the government demonstrate transparency and ensure that the opposition is fully aware of what is happening prior to bringing these things to Parliament so that we can make a positive contribution and to ensure that the industry is protected and it is allowed to grow. Thank you.
As many, Chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Jenny Isaacs Dotson.
Good morning, fellow senators, Madam President. It is indeed a pleasure to stand here this morning to speak in this honorable place. And I wish again to thank the Honorable Prime Minister for this appointment, like I always say, which is still a very learning experience for me. I'm learning a lot about politics. Madam President, I stand today to speak to all women in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas as we are about to celebrate International Women's Day tomorrow, Friday, March 8, 2019. And I'd be so bold to say that I'm speaking on behalf of all of the women in here today and all the men. The theme for this year is Balance for Better, and I think that the Bahamas is looking at Think Equal, Build Smart, which also speaks to balance. Right now is a great and important time in history for us as women to do everything possible to help forge a more gender-balanced world. Women have come a long way, yet there's still more to be achieved. Madam President, the United Nations website states that International Women's Day is an occasion marked by women's groups around the world. This date is also commemorated at the United Nations and is designated in many countries as a national holiday. And I guess one day we'll get there. We'll also have a holiday. When women on all continents, often divided by national boundaries and by ethnic, linguistic, cultural, economic, and political differences, come together to celebrate their day, they can look back to a tradition that represents at least 9 decades of struggle for equality, justice, peace, and development. International Women's Day, Madam President, is a story of ordinary women as makers of history. And I think that that is important. Ordinary women. Not the rich, not the powerful. Ordinary women. It is rooted in the centuries-old struggle of women to participate in society on an equal footing with men. It is indeed the day in the Bahamas when we celebrate all women from Inagua to Exuma to Long Island to Abaco to Cat Island, Andros, Grand Bahama, Eleuthera, San Salvador, Rum Key, Auckland, Crooked Island, all of them. All the keys, Black Point, Staniel Key, Farmers Key. Then I'll have to start naming all of them. But all women in the country, not just Nassau or Grand Bahama. All women, including women from the Family Islands, whom we cannot forget. And Senator Knowles made sure to tell me, Ferguson Knowles, they mention them Family Island women. So we cannot forget our women in the Family Islands. It's a story of our great-great-grandparents, grandparents, to our parents who were shipped from the motherland Africa as slaves. Slavery was eventually abolished, where we had segregation, where we had desegregation, to us working as maids, waiters, waitresses, cooks, to eventually being able to own our own businesses and doing whatever we needed to do to send our children to school to get a better way of life. Throughout all these changes in our society and in our lives, from slavery to now, women have been the pillars of Bahamian society. Therefore, International Women's Day is a time for all of us as women to reflect on the progress that we have made, to call for change, and to celebrate acts of courage and determination by ordinary women who have played an extraordinary role in the history of women's rights. We must all realize that violence is not a women's issue, it's a business issue. The race is on for the gender-balanced boardroom, a gender-balanced government, a gender balance media coverage, a gender balance of employees, more gender balance in wealth, gender balance sports coverage, gender balance which is essential for economies and communities to thrive. It's very, very important. Women, let us not forget that throughout the world, we are still behind men in many areas. And there still exists a gender pay gap, whether we want to recognize that or not. And I know that the Department of Social Services is gathering some data to support that. I listened to them this morning on 96.9 as I was coming here. We have a lack of women representation in politics and business, inadequate access to education, gender imbalance in some professions, and in essence, my sisters, we have to realize that the glass ceiling still exists. We seem to think that we've shattered it, but I don't think so. It's still there. A little crack. We need to crack it some more. Some other issues that women face are human trafficking, poverty, health, armed conflict, health issues, armed conflict, violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and being refugees. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres reminds us that women's rights are human rights. But in these troubled times, as our world becomes more unpredictable and chaotic, the rights of women and girls are being reduced, restricted, and reversed. Madam President, empowering women and girls is the only way to protect their rights and to make sure that they realize their full potential. We all must remember as women and men that women are the creators of life. They are our first teachers, the first managers in our lives. They manage our lives, all right? What do we do without them? They're the ones that create change in our society, and they provide the harmony that we need in our society. This is the day when we find balance for the better to motivate our entire community to think, to act, and to be gender inclusive. In the Bahamas, we see women, despite our numbers, struggling to become owners of their own homes and businesses, dealing with domestic violence, health issues such as cancer, diabetes, hypertension, heart conditions, just to name a few. Being the chief breadwinner, Madam President, and the only role model within the home, not getting the same pay as their male counterparts, and lack of access to education, particularly technical and vocational education, and employment opportunities. It is time for us, Madam President, to tear down any barriers that our women on the family islands face and ensure that they get the same opportunities as women, as I said, in Nassau. This is critically important as all women deserve the same, Madam President. We must ensure that they have access to the same services, communications, technology, business opportunities, finance, healthcare services, and education as women. Additionally, we must ensure that they can own land, be involved in the decision-making process, and their rights are protected under the law. When we look at our political system in the Bahamas, we see that again, and it was already spoken to, the very few women who offered to run in the general elections 2017. And the fact that there are only 5 out of 39 parliamentarians in the House of Assembly, and in the current cabinet, there's only 1 female. Maybe this is a time for us to establish a quota for women in Parliament, and I think Senator Enfield spoke to that. And in some countries, that has already been done. So that may be something that we want to look at. Let us all today and tomorrow look at women throughout the length and breadth of the Bahamas and see the beauty of each other, the wonderful talents we all have, the contributions we all can make, and say that we, the women, will continue to be the movers and shakers of this Bahamas moving forward in 2019. Let us commit, Madam President, to supporting each other, whether or not we like this one or that one, or we feel some jealousy because she got the position and I didn't, or just, us, we can't stand her. I just don't like her. My spirit don't take to her. All right? But we as women have to put those petty differences aside and commit to balance for better. We all need to pledge and commit to standing up and being an advocate for maintaining a gender parity mindset, advocate and influence other beliefs and actions, and we must all celebrate women's achievements. We as women must put our differences aside and support each other. It's time for us as women, Madam President, to take our rightful place in this Bahama land. Yes. Right, my sisters? On March 8th, tomorrow, International Women's Day, let us all wear purple because that is the color of royalty, yes, justice, and dignity. As we balance our lives for the better of all of us, individually and collectively, and commit to supporting each other as women as we move forward from today and tomorrow. And where? And onwards, forever, whether we like each other or not. Madam President, I now turn my attention to the Anti-Terrorism Regulations 2019, which were designed to support the Anti-Terrorism Bill 2018. These regulations support the already passed, as I said, Anti-Terrorism Bill 2018 and provide teeth to this comprehensive, modern-day, and required piece of legislation designed to counter all forms of terrorist activity, including the targeting of all assets, financial and otherwise, that are related to any terrorist activity. These regulations will further protect the citizens of the Bahamas, our sovereignty, and strengthen our financial sector. These regulations, once passed, will be a landmark one for our government and will show our strong assurance to realizing the already mentioned goals and to meet our regional and international obligations, as the AG already said. Madam President, the anti-terrorism regulation speaks to the appointment of focal and primary points. It allows the investigation and listing of a terrorist entity, an order to be made by the AG office, and the named entity has 60 days to apply for a review of the listing order. Financial institutions will scrutinize accounts, Madam President, for suspicious transactions and report the same to the Financial Intelligence Act. These reports will, of course, be investigated and may result in property freezing or seizure order. If an entity is identified and proven to be a designated entity, Madam President, it will be reported to the United Nations Security Council committees and other jurisdictions by the Attorney General. In addition, Madam President, various agencies such as Immigration, Customs, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, based on a list provided of these designated entities, will prevent them from entering into or through the Bahamas. Further, the Civil Aviation Authority will also have the ability to prevent the landing, the takeoff, or travel through our airspace of any aircraft thought to be owned by a designated entity. Further, Madam President, these regulations will prevent the trafficking in arms, nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. Designated entities, Madam President, whose assets have been frozen, can make a request to the Attorney General to give them an exemption for basic expenses such as food, rent, mortgage, medicine, taxes, insurance, bills, and any other payments they may need to survive. The Attorney General will let the United Nations Security Council know of the request made, and they will make a decision and inform the Attorney General, who shall comply with the decision. Madam President, designated entities who have been mistakenly identified as such can appeal to the Attorney General once he or she are satisfied that the entity is not the actual listed entity. Further, a designated entity can also apply to the United Nations Security Council to be deleted from the list through the Ombudsman of the United Nations. Any designated entity removed, the Attorney General will receive a notification regarding the same. In essence, Madam President, these regulations are, as the Attorney General already said, a part of making us compliant with the FATF recommendations that was made and ensuring that we are compliant. Madam President, therefore, as I take my seat, I support the regulations, which, as I said, support the Anti-Terrorism Bill 2018 and enforce the same so that every citizen in the Bahamas can feel safe from terrorism, which is a global threat. I thank you, Madam President.
As many, the chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Fred Mitchell.
Coming back. Okay. Thank you, Madam President. The Senator Darville has already outlined what the formal position of the Progressive Liberal Party is with regard to this. But, and I thank him for quite a comprehensive statement. I wanted to say one or two things more generally about the whole regime of the financial that now affects the financial services sector. And in particular, an approach which was commended to us by Mr. Alfred Sears, QC. And I saw also this morning a statement from the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, who is the chairman of CARICOM, talking about what our countries need to do to deal with these issues relating to the financial services sector and the complaints of our people that no matter what we do, they keep pushing the goalpost back. Thankfully, with regard to this latest so-called blacklist, I think largely because the Americans objected, and of course Saudi Arabia was part of the list, there was a substantial pushback from the developed countries with regard to this. Now, what this demonstrates to me, of course, is a point which you always made, is there's a great deal of hypocrisy which is involved, and double standards which is involved in this. When there are certain countries which stand to get hurt or damaged, or when business is going to be damaged significantly with developed countries, suddenly they get a bout of conscience, and there are exceptions being made to the rules. So one rule for one, but one rule and one rule for another. The Prime Minister of St. Lucia, coming out of the heads of government meeting which took place last week in, the Prime Minister of St. Kitts, coming out of the meeting which took place last week in St. Kitts, indicated that CARICOM should begin taking a stronger position as a united voice to deal with an internationally United Nations type-based approach to dealing with the strictures of financial services. Because heretofore, and this is something which the Bahamas, when I was foreign minister, when Alfred Sears was the Attorney General, and he repeated it when he spoke to the University of the Bahamas a couple of days ago, was saying that instead of this being based in the OECD, instead of it being based in the EU, instead of it being based in the individual efforts of the United States, that there ought to be a United Nations-based approach to this so that everybody has signed on to a worldwide set of standards, and not standards which are proximate or appropriate for the wishes and desires of these individual traders that I just mentioned. And so I'd like to speak up for that approach. This legislation and the regulations which are to come into force as a result of this are UN-based regulations. We are all a part of the United Nations, and so therefore we are at the table, so to speak, when these matters, or have the right of access when these matters are being planned. Before I left, I don't know whether it's still the intention of the government, because you mentioned the United Nations Security Council. We had committed ourselves to trying to get the Bahamas on the United Nations Security Council by the year 2031. But that's only available to certain countries because other countries are permanent members and there's a rotation. So we have to plan long in advance if we want to get there, and there has to be a significant campaign. But at least we can get at that table. And I hope that it's still a goal of the country to get on the Security Council by 2031. Jamaica has been on twice. Even St. Vincent has been on once. So it seems to me, now that we've accomplished the Human Rights Council, that the UN Security Council is an appropriate place for us to be at the table at another forum where these matters are being discussed. The problem with all of these kinds of general regulations always, in my view, comes down to the details. So we've now put in place a whole set of strictures, and this is another set of them, which will not really affect ordinary people, except that they form part of the same whole cloth that I've been discussing. For example, when I was in the UK last year in December, I learned that transactions from the Bahamas by notice of the British Treasury, our financial transactions from the Bahamas, I'm advised, are supposed to have additional scrutiny because we are not a country that has in place what they consider to be a vigorous enough regime with regard to money laundering and the like. And I said to myself that this was only going to be an inconvenience to people trying to pay their children's school fees. Because the likelihood of what they expect coming out of the Bahamas was next to zero. But every time somebody wanted to pay their children's school fees or to start a bank coming from the Bahamas, and you're a Bahamian citizen in the UK, you have to jump through additional hoops in order to get it done. I'm not sure what we do to correct this, but this is of course something for our diplomats to address. And then of course the total and utter nuisance of this expression being politically exposed persons. It is the most nefarious description. It causes great inconvenience and has interfered with legitimate trade. And it appears that once set in cement now, that there's nothing anybody can do about this. Except I always say that if you have your voice and your voice is all you have, then you use your voice. So I'm using my voice today to say I am against this. It is a nuisance and something needs to be done about it. And I'll come to a suggestion which I have at the end about this. My younger brother just sent me a note talking about the use of cash. And I see where the government or the governor of the central bank says that there's going to be digital currency, he now says, which is going to be the substitute for not having banks in the family islands. So presumably you can be sitting in Acklands and you don't need paper currency. You can now use digital currency to get what you want. All of which is fine so long as the digital platform works. And so long as when you go in the shop, they don't tell you the machine is down, which is what happens so often in this country with regard to our digital platforms. And I raise this again because it does not appear that in our proactive planning, anybody is paying attention to the telecommunications and data infrastructure in our country. Everyone's talking internationally about 5G. 5G will allow, in addition to other things, for operations. That is, for doctors to be sitting in New York or wherever they are and actually conduct an operation using robots and electronic means in the theater here in New Providence. Right now, it's not possible because the lag time on the 4G is too long. Even though that's quick, it's not quick enough. And so you need instantaneous, and 5G is going to make that possible. So the question is, if we're talking about digital currency, and if we're talking about going to having a country that has the latest digital platforms, I see there's on the government's website some talk about, the Prime Minister met with the leader of Estonia down in St. Kitts to talk about e-government. All of these things are going to require substantial investments in telecommunications in order for this to work. And so far, no one has been able to say how we're going to pay for it, where the investment is going to come from. What we know is that the present infrastructure as it relates to telecommunications and data in the Bahamas today is simply unacceptable. Too many drop calls. Access is fitful. Try making a voice over IP call, constantly dropping. You have to call back and so on and so on, all of which should not exist if we're going to have a substantial digital platform. So to come back to this issue of cash now, I had always thought that under the Central Bank Act, legal tender in the Bahamas was not something that any merchant or vendor could refuse. In other words, if you have a public license and I show up to your shop and I give you this $1 bill,
Yeah, I can tell you by that now. I disclosed an offense. I should take it to an authorized dealer as soon as way. An authorized dealer. I could go across to Scotiabank in a minute, yeah. But this is legal tender in the Bahamas. And so I thought that once you show up with this, no one could turn you away. I think there are some exceptions, like if you have $5, more than $5 worth of pennies, for example, they can refuse you. But anything below $5 worth of pennies, it's fine. But this is legal tender. And so there was an announcement a couple months ago that American Airlines said that they will no longer be accepting cash for the payment of their airline tickets in the Bahamas. I thought, well, that's strange, because I thought, again, if I show up to the counter, they have a license in the Bahamas, and I give them my money, how can they refuse legal tender in the Bahamas for their services? Seems a little odd. But, you know, there's no consumer advocacy going on in the Bahamas, so no one said anything, and I guess other airlines would be going in that direction. But what he said, very interesting to me, my younger brother, is that one of the cities in the United States, the city of Philadelphia, has actually passed an ordinance that says you cannot turn down legal tender. If I present myself to you with legal tender in my hand, you cannot turn it down. So, you know, I just put this out again to consumers in our country, because it's a consumer issue. And there are reasons why whoever invented cash invented a great thing, because it is liquid, it can move around, it's acceptable, it's private. And when you start talking now about everybody going to digital platforms, what do you think you're going to be doing? All your business will be in the street. As simple as that, because you will not have control over your assets, somebody else will. And it's as simple as when you go in the shop and they tell you the machine isn't working. You know, you go to a restaurant, you eat the food, and they present you with the bill, and you take out your debit card and they say, oh, sorry, our machine isn't working. So, of course, these days now, when you go in these restaurants, they tell you in advance. Like places in Bimini in particular, for some reason, you don't have credit card machines almost anywhere except in the hotels. So I thought to bring that to the attention of the Senate as we are discussing this bill. It is therefore important for us to think about the nuisances which these laws that we have agreed to can actually lead to. The nightmare of trying to get a bank account. I have a youngster, well, I guess he's not really a youngster, except in terms of my age, but he has just started a digital company which you can order food from restaurants. So any restaurant in the Bahamas you want, you can just send him send his company a digital message, and they will collect the food for you for a fee. He told me it took him 6 months to get his bank account established. 6 months. Once the 6 months were up, the next thing he had to do was to get a digital platform for payment. The bank he was dealing with told him it would take them 3 months to process that before he could get that up and going. Now I ask you, I mean, I don't know if this is typical, but you know, this sort of thing is unacceptable. And even though the central bank governor says that they are now going to address regulations to try and deal with the nuisances, it just seemed to me that what was advanced was a whole lot more bureaucracy. Because a woman was, a friend of mine out west, was saying to me, I've been banking with this bank for the 60 years that I've been living in the Bahamas. And suddenly they're telling me that they don't know who I am. And so if they told me the other day that if I don't come in by 3 o'clock, that they're going to cancel my account. Something they wanted, a water bill, a light bill, some rubbish that they wanted to establish who the person is. And at her senior years, she goes into a bank, and it's 2:30 in the afternoon. And it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The door is closed. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon before she's actually able to get out of the bank. And of course, you know, it isn't like the old days. My friend George McCartney says he used to go to a certain bank, and you know, he used to know everyone. His nephew used to work in the bank, so there was no issue. He showed up in the bank one day, and the nephew wasn't there, and he looked around and said, "My Lord, I don't know anyone in this bank." And in this country, God help you if you don't know anyone in the place, because it appears the treatment is delivered to you based on who you are or who you know. Otherwise, you just got to suffer. So all of this, I bring this discussion because it is a cauldron of swirling things, I'll put it that way, that we need to address, because the underlying criticism, even of that misguided fellow MEP in Europe, is that they have the impression that in our countries across the region, there is a systemic failure to deal with details. So you pass acts, you pass regulations, but nothing happens. He happens to be wrong and misdirected on this one, but I think that's the underlying thing. And it is a criticism which we from the opposition have raised from time to time. With the passage of all of these laws, the question is, you put in place all this bureaucracy. First, can you afford to pay for it? And secondly, can you actually execute it and carry it out? The final point I'd say is just to join on International Women's Day. You know, no question, if I were a judge of the court, I would say I had the advantage of listening to your script, and I agree entirely without change with everything you say. But I want the leader for the government I will, discuss the details, but I'm very concerned about the treatment which is being meted out to our single female Rhodes Scholar in the government service today. She is not being treated, I'm advised, properly by the government, and has lost salary and benefits. This is something I think you need to address, because this is a dedicated individual to the service of this country. Came home at great sacrifice to the country and does not deserve, if I am correct, the ill treatment which I'm advised is being meted out. I should be grateful if you would look into that matter, and I would say to Senator Isaacs Dotson that this is a matter I hope you would take some personal interest in, since you raised the question of women and the treatment of women. I rested there, and I will explain the details of it afterwards. So you know that we support this and support the general efforts, but I would wish for these issues, I hope that we have some consumer association which rises up at some point to deal with these more general issues. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, everyone's finished, but I need to call for the vote.
Ms. Robbins, Madam President, if I may.
Chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Carl Bethel.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank all colleague senators for the quality of their interventions. I thank members opposite for the continued united front on these issues that, barring one or two little comments, snide comments, or one or two little statements from some people who, want to make a point. Erroneously, it turned out. There's genuinely been a firm adherence on the opposite side to the commitments that we made to each other, that as a nation, we would not seek to be scoring points on each other on matters such as this. Let me remind colleagues here in the Bahamas that whenever you have a government such as the Bahamas that is engaged with the international community and has been engaged on these issues, when there are public statements by the opposition tearing down the government, this becomes a matter of conversation over there. It gets posted up on their digital boards as they're walking their meetings. And one gets the impression, I got the impression, looking at what they did to the British Virgin Islands in a similar situation, where an opposition leader, basically to do with their citizenship for investment policy, was pointing fingers at the government. Oh, we told you not about this, and then the government's come back, but you introduced it, and it was a big joke. I don't like to see any of our fellow travelers in this region, our brothers and sisters. We came on different boats. We came from the same place, being made into laughing stocks, and I was intent that the Bahamas not be in that position. So I reached out to the opposition, and I'm grateful that I got the highest level commitment from the opposition that we would not go down that road of name calling and finger pointing. And even when I had to answer a certain statement, I was careful to remind the Bahamian people and the opposition that we have to have a united front on this. I could call and point names and point fingers, call names, do this, pull, do all sorts of things. That is not going to help us. What we need to do now is what we have been doing so well together, government and opposition, holding a united front, consulting widely with each other and with, respectively, with the financial communities of this country, so that we can all help each other to fashion the best response this nation can make to preserve that valuable sector of our economy from all attack by those who would strip us of it. I spent many years like the leader opposite in public life. And my esteemed brother here, brother-in-law, and brother-in-law. Brother first, brother-in-law by other circumstances. But first, my brother, as you are.
My willful act.
As you are, willful act, indeed. Irrevocable before the Lord. He became my brother-in-law. but the point is, you two, member opposite, are my brother. We are all in this boat. And no, and I didn't go before the Lord on that. That's revocable. But you see, we are in this boat together, this Bahamas together. We have to make it work. I have been in public life long enough to have seen these same people going into another room, putting on a different hat, strip our Caribbean neighbors of every single preference, market access, every single element of a viable economy, and leaving them with their caps in their hands. And they're happy. They're happy. Those same people who took away the banana regime, who took away the rum regime. Okay? And so at the end of the day, we must all hang together, or they will hang us separately. On that note, Madam President, I now move that the question now be put.
It has been moved and seconded that the resolution be agreed. As many as are in favor would say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The resolution is agreed. Discharge of select committees.
None, Madam President.
The senator had asked Jo Beth Colby Davis to bring some brief remarks. I'd like to recognize her now.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to join with the chorus of my colleagues in the Senate and those in the lower house to bring remarks on behalf of International Women's Day under the UN theme, Think Equal, Build Smart, Innovative for Change, and the overall theme, Balance for Better. And I joined with Senator Dotson as she made comment about celebrating and honoring those regular women that we don't hear much about. Because while I can stand here and pay homage to our foremothers that fought tirelessly to ensure as women our voices were heard and played their part in society to fight for equality and the right for women to vote, I am, however, going to place on record the celebration of other women who work every day to make not just countries more fair, more equal, and more free, but often many of these women risk themselves and their families to get this work done without recognition. As I drove to the Senate this morning, Madam President, I passed caregivers, lunch ladies, straw vendors, hair braiders, janitors, who were out early making an honest living for their families, many of whom were able to educate their children through university and contribute to the society of doctors, lawyers, engineers, bankers, politicians, preachers, and teachers. And I wish to name a few of the women in my life that played a pivotal role in making me the success I am today. My mother, Irma Colby, my aunts, Nan Davis and Laureen Murray, my nana, the late Clementina Francis, but the most important, the one who contributed selflessly by staying at home raising her family, my grandmother, Lillian Garland Budo, who is 91 years of age and suffering Alzheimer's. Without hesitation, over 20 years ago, my grandmother moved from the Bahamas, the place she called home, to Atlanta to assist in raising me and my sisters, while allowing my parents the opportunity to rebuild their lives following the terrible storm in Grand Bahama, Hurricane Andrew, that left our home in shambles and our finances almost depleted. My grandmother, Lillian Budo, made it her responsibility to raise all of her children, her grandchildren, and the majority of her great-grandchildren, because that is what was important to her. And I am sure many of you women and men here today have that one strong or many other females in your life that you can celebrate. And for this reason and that and many others, I just want to say to all Bahamian women that your journeys, your achievements, and your very presence are a perfect illustration of the progress we've made thus far, but we have a long way to go. And while we still have a way to go in the journey of gender equality, innovation, and balancing for a better role, I celebrate the achievements because women are a part of the majority of graduates of college and universities. We make up nearly half of the Bahamian workforce, though we are not paid more for it, as Senator Dotson spoke to earlier. Women are thriving in every sector of our society. We are leading businesses. We're serving at the highest levels of government. We're breaking barriers and succeeding in careers that our mothers and grandmothers never could have imagined. And time again, we have seen that countries across the globe are more prosperous. They're more peaceful when women are more equal and have the rights and opportunities they deserve. We're still underrepresented, so we still have a lot of work to do. However, we are making great strides, and for that, we should all be grateful. When I celebrate and say Happy International Women's Day. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Mildred Hall Watson.
Madam President, fellow senators, women of the Bahamas, I rise to participate in what many of my colleagues in the lower house yesterday and in these chambers today Madam President, fellow senators, and all of my Bahamian female colleagues and sisters, I rise to join with my sisters in the lower house yesterday and my sisters in these chambers to congratulate women, not only in the Bahamas, but all over the world, for the contributions that they have made in every sector of our society. There are many times in which they may not be recognized for what they do, but I think even in the lack of recognition, we see the results of the work that they do. And so as we lift them up for all that they have and will do in the future, I think it is important that we stress what many of my sisters have said about us fighting even harder to be recognized on parity with our male colleagues for the contributions that we have made. Despite our small numbers in Parliament and many other decision-making areas, we have women who have made major positive steps. And when I speak of women, I speak again, as my colleagues have said, not only the women whose names are household recognition, but the women who rise every day and they move forward and take care of their children and their family. They get up in the morning and they prepare their children to go to school. They prepare themselves to work. They get back home in the evenings, and they do the same thing in addition to taking care, in many instances, of their mothers. And so as we move forward and we recognize these important women, I would like to mention the importance of a major woman in my life who was my mother. I loved my father. He was a great contributor to our family, but my mother was definitely the individual who made our family a family. And so I thank God for that. She was the kind of woman who she was. And as we move forward, fellow sisters, please, one of the things that Senator Dotson indicated is we must support each other. It is so often you hear this and that and who doesn't like who. It isn't important whether we love each other. What is important is that we support each other for our gender and the contributions that we have made. And so, fellow sisters in the Bahamas, I congratulate you to continue to work hard. And the next time we come up against a situation like this where we celebrate International Women's Day, we will have even more things to give our sisters credit for. Thank you, Madam President.
Chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Jasmine Darius.
Good morning, Madam President, colleagues. Good morning, Bahamas. I too rise to join my colleagues to celebrate on this International Women's Day tomorrow. And in particular, I would like to say the accomplishments of Bahamian women over the years are undeniable and significant, to say the least. Bahamian women have made and continue to make their mark in every sphere and sector of our society with recorded notable success in education, in politics, in religion, the corporate world, law enforcement, media, and civic society. Research shows that progress in women's employment, health, and education leads to greater economic growth and stronger societies. When women and men are equally empowered as political and social actors, governments are more representative and far more effective. I am minded to highlight the women on the forefront of the political battlefield, both in the upper and the lower house, on both sides of the political divide, who serve this nation selflessly and sacrificially, fighting daily for equality, sustainable development, economic empowerment for the girls and women that we wholeheartedly serve. When I think of notable women, I am mindful of the brave women of the suffrage movement. I think of the first woman who registered to vote, Ms. Ruby Ann Darling. I am mindful of the first female MP and cabinet minister, Dame Janet Boswick, the first female speaker, Ms. Italia Johnson, the first female chairman of a political party, the Honorable Glenys Hannah Martin, the first female political party leader, my friend, Arinthia Komalafe. Congratulations. I also am reminded of the first female obstetrician gynecologist, one of our very own, Dr. the Honorable Senator Mildred Hall Watson, and and also a Bahamian woman who is a premier. She's not the premier of the Bahamas, but she's a premier in the Turks and Caicos Island. She is Ms. Charlene Cartwright Robinson. She's a Bahamian woman who is a premier. So we have come far, and we still have far to go. I pause to also highlight the many unsung Bahamian heroes of this nation. Those who may do small acts or small deeds, but cause us to do great things. I am especially mindful of those that train and cultivate women like myself to stand within these great halls. I am reminded of all of the women on the islands that work hard, that carry water, that go in the fields, that go in the shop, that are entrepreneurs. Especially today, my Androsian women. I'm Andros born, so I must highlight them. The strong, resilient, industrious, and intelligent Andros women. I'm mindful of my grandmother, who takes care of all of the Anglican priests in the community. She's also a community activist, and everybody in Fresh Creek knows Mabel Stubbs. I am mindful of my mother, Loretta Stubbs Farrington, in Fresh Creek, right now watching me on TV. I am mindful of Doris Adderley, my primary school principal, who is also well and kicking and still teaching in Fresh Creek, Andros. I'm mindful of Miss Teresa Menace, an entrepreneur on the island. Miss Donna Stubbs, Shirley Gator, Naomi Clark, and all of the many other women that are the pillars of our society. Lastly, but definitely not least, I would like to highlight the mother of this nation, First Lady Patricia Menace, a beautiful and intelligent Bahamian woman who I can truly say is not really concerned about image, but about impact. And I want to salute her because she's been traveling the islands, cultivating, nurturing, and helping to groom young women to become better. We traveled to Andros on March 5th, and we went to Central Andros High, where the principal, Mrs. Wanda Thompson, greeted us, and we were able to speak to the young women at Central Andros High about thinking equal, balancing for better, and innovating for change. And so I salute Mrs. Menace today for standing strong, for being a beacon of light to all of the young ladies, not just a mother to her own children, but to a mother of the young girls, particularly in this nation. Today we have come far as women, and we still have far to go. May we continue to empower, educate, equip, impact, fight for equality and justice for all of our women and girls. May God continue to bless the wombed man everywhere, from Grand Bahama, Abaco and Bimini in the north, all the way to Mayaguana and Nagua in the south. God bless you, and happy International Women's Day.
As many?
Madam President, let me just, on behalf of the man...
The chair now recognizes Senator the Honorable Carl Bethel.
Thank you.
Mrs. Carl Bethel.
You see what I mean? Madam President, on behalf of the man part of the woman, as was pointed out, I just wish to join on behalf of all of we of that disposition in congratulating all the senators who've spoken and acknowledging the enormous importance of women to our nation's life. Of course, I must just, acknowledge the enormous importance of my dear mother, Yvette, better than me, and my brother Lyle, because she brought us into this world, and my dear grandmother who passed, Tilla, Muriel Bain, what we know as Tilla, and my paternal grandmother, Agatha, all of the women who've made all of us possible. I think it's best summarized in a story that I read in the press recently, where the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar Mosque, which houses the Al-Azhar University, which is the second oldest university in the world, the first being another Islamic university founded in the 9th century in Morocco. Al-Azhar was founded in the year 970 by the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt. So when you hear certain persons elsewhere thinking that they're the be-all and end-all of knowledge, let them know. Africa was the fount of knowledge. Africa formed the first universities. And this leading cleric in Egypt made it.
Go to Harvard, though.
We'll not be distracted. This leading, he's the Mufti, the Grand Mufti, and the leading cleric in Egypt, was arguing, very controversial there, where he said that polygamy should be discouraged. That polygamy is not an Islamic mandate. What it did was said, is going on, and it has to be done. It was going on before the Islamic religion, polygamy, marrying 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 women. It has to be regulated, and it has to be fair. That was a big controversy in Egypt. But he went on and made another statement, which I found to be very profound. He said, the suppression of women, they cannot continue. He said, women are more than half of the population. If you suppress women, it is like trying to walk on one foot.
Oh, and I know.
And you would know, yes, member opposite, with your little injury. But the point is, imagine this nation trying to walk on one foot because women are being suppressed and marginalized. It cannot happen. In fact, we are so proud in the Bahamas that yes, in this particular dispensation, women are somewhat underrepresented, but on both parties, quite frankly. But we know that in all agencies of government, be it the armed services, be it the education, be it in the higher levels of the public service, women play a profoundly important and majority role in governance in this country. So on that note, I wish to wish every single female, woman in the Bahamas and elsewhere a very happy International Women's Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Senators, for acknowledging the day and talking about all of those women who've impacted your lives. But I'd also like to mention 4 former parliamentarians who have contributed much to the political landscape in Grand Bahama and New Providence, and that would be Mrs. Verne Grant, who is a former member of Parliament for the 8 Mile Rock constituency, Mrs. Pleasant Bridgewater, a former member of Parliament for the Marco City constituency, Ann Presenti, a former member of Parliament for the Pine Ridge constituency, and Cleola Hamilton, the former member of Parliament for South Beach in New Providence.
Sorry, Madam President, may I just interject? We cannot, in listing female parliamentarians, forget the earth-shaking, pioneering, groundbreaking role played by the Honorable Dame Janet Gwyneth Boswick in being the first lady elected to Parliament. And I'm sorry, I had to make that point. Thank you.
Senators, the reason for that intervention with those 4 women, you would have noted that a large ad was in the local paper acknowledging Dame Doris Johnson as well as the Speaker, Dame Janet Bostwick, but the ad did not include those 4 women that I outlined, and that was the reason for mentioning those 4 former parliamentarians. Thank you very much. Discharge of select committees. Notices for future meetings.
Madam President, the Senate, we intend to adjourn the Senate sine die, but when we come back, we will hopefully have a new bill tabled from the House of Assembly, and then we will debate the investment funds bill. We will then adjourn sine die and await another bill so that we don't have any more to come just to table something. The idea would be to have a smooth operation henceforth. And on that note, I just wish to renew everything that is on the agenda every matter on the agenda in the name of the government. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Fred Mitchell.
Yes, I'm advised that we missed out Mother Pratt, Cynthia Mother Pratt, who's
I'm
the
sorry.
former Deputy Prime Minister.
She was not in the ad.
I'm not sure the ad, but I'm just talking
She
about
was.
the names of people.
Yeah, remember, the only reason for calling those 4 names was relative to the ad that was placed in the paper.
Oh, I see.
And Cynthia Mother Pratt, Dame Janet
President
Boxford,
General.
yes, all were included in that.
You also forgot Sylvia Scriven.
Sylvia Scriven.
Sylvia Scriven.
She's in the ad as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't read it. I don't buy the papers. So.
Yeah, yeah. And so there was no, I really wanted to also thank the effort of putting certain women in the paper, but those 4 women as former parliamentarians were left out. All of the other women you have called are in the ad.
Oh, I'm relieved.
Thank you. Yes, everybody except them 4.
I'd like to renew the notices down in the opposition. Is it the intention of the government to debate this budget statement?
No, sir. The legal and constitutional basis on which it has been determined that a budget debate on a midterm budget that has no appropriation bills was fully canvassed in the other place. I don't propose to repeat the arguments. Thank you.
I was just remarking, Madam Speaker, that, I see public funds have been spent on propaganda. This is the budget.
Senators, I want to be reminded of
No, well, whatever it is.
Excuse me, leaders, we are now at notices for future meetings.
The budget, any document
Excuse
of
me.
government is a people's
Gentlemen,
reflection.
we are at notices for future meetings.
This is not, but you can't
Orders for clerk,
be spending public money on it.
adjournment.
Madam President, I beg leave. You don't think I'll have a row after this, but I beg leave to move, not me, I mean me and the member opposite. I beg leave to move that the Senate on its rising be adjourned sine die. If I may obtain a second.
It has been moved and seconded that the business of the Senate adjourn sine die. As many as are in favor would say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Well, the ayes have it, and the Senate is adjourned sine die.
Madam President, I beg leave to move that the Senate do now adjourn.
Final adjournment, the Senate is now adjourned.